We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
So we have with us someone who's really special. His name is Dr. Rob Lusk. He is the clinical director at the Baby Fold, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about what that is and what they do there. He's also an adjunct faculty member at the Illinois Wesleyan University, and he is a specialist and expert in trauma treatment. So he's going to have a lot to offer us today. We're going to talk a lot about trauma as a child and how those experiences can be treated, and how as an adult person in that child's life, you can help them out. So thank you, Dr. Lusk, for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And just like you said, I typically have to explain the place where I work. It's called the Baby Fold, and the reason is it was originally an orphanage back in the 1800s. The idea was they were taking babies into the fold, and the name has stuck ever since, but we obviously are no longer an orphanage. You know, we don't hold babies. We're not a diaper service. We're really a multi-service agency. We have 15 different programs at this point, ranging from 3 non-public schools in Illinois, at least where my agency is located. If you're a nonprofit like we are and you operate a special education private school, it's called non-public. So these are for youth from kindergarten through high school with a variety of pretty significant behavioral and emotional issues. And a huge percentage of those students, more than 80%, have experienced significant trauma, and so have their families. And we also operate some kind of traditional child welfare programs, foster care, intact family services for families that are involved in the child welfare system, where we're trying to get kids, either keep them in homes, get them back to parents as quick as possible, work with the families as well as the youth to resolve trauma-related issues. And so even though we have a number of different programs, trauma really is, in a sense, the core issue that we're facing pretty much across the board.
Yeah, so you see some kiddos and family members that have experienced some really tough situations.
Yes, there are a variety of different types of trauma, obviously, that both children and adults experience. The kids that we see that tend to have the most problems tend to be youth who have experienced what's sometimes called chronic trauma, which really just means long-term trauma, or complex trauma, which usually just means more than one kind of trauma. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. The average child in the United States, according to some very good research, will experience at least one major traumatic event before they turn 18. So it is more common than not for youth in the United States to experience a trauma, what we sometimes call a big T trauma. The idea basically being that we can experience both the big traumas and then little traumas, little T traumas, as we often call them, that by themselves aren't as problematic, but they can accumulate and become, in some ways, just as bad as the big T's.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about what are some common reasons why a child might develop a trauma reaction? And maybe we just need to start with what a trauma reaction is, and maybe define PTSD or traumatic stress disorder.
Yes, a great point. And I think in general, I like the definition that's used by the federal government. Has a fairly simple definition of trauma, which is to think about 3 E's. The idea is that there is an event that happens, or sometimes a series of events. But the first E is a bad thing or a bad event happens to the child. Mm-hmm. And then the second one is that it's experienced in a horrible fashion. Usually the child, and this is true for adults as well, will be very afraid that they might die, or someone very close to them might die, or they might witness something horrible happening. Again, it's often a death or a horrible injury or something like that. And then the third E after the event occurs and then you experience it horribly is that you have negative effects that are long lasting. And so PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was really the first trauma disorder that was formally recognized in our diagnostic system. And that still came along fairly late. It was in the third edition of our diagnostic manual. And it was really created primarily for Vietnam veterans and rape and assault survivors. And so the criteria for PTSD don't always fit children that well. In fact, the research suggests that in general, they kind of fit, but often they don't fit real well and often not well enough to truly get the diagnosis. And so it makes things a little more complicated for kids. But in general, the types of problems and the symptoms that are in that diagnosis, in the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, are, well, the exposure to a traumatic event, and then the youth, and again, very similar for adults, will re-experience the trauma in some fashion. It will come back to haunt them. Nightmares and flashbacks are often the most common types of re-experiencing symptoms. The younger the child, the more likely they might also do what's sometimes called reenactment, where they will actually act out aspects of the trauma, sometimes in repetitive play. I was working with a girl, for example, whose brother had drowned, and she was we had a pool. This was doll play, essentially, which with a young child, whether you're doing trauma therapy or not, if their medium of expression is play, you often have to use play to try to help resolve things. But she was just picking up the doll that sort of represented her brother, throwing him in the pool, pulling him out, throwing him in the pool, pulling him out. So that kind of repetitive play is something that you see in adults, much less likely to see that sort of repetition in adults as opposed to children. But in adults, again, you will tend to see more of the nightmares, flashbacks, and you get those a lot in children too.
So it sounds like there's when you're looking at a child and you're wondering, well, is this PTSD? Is this a trauma reaction? What I'm hearing you say is that it may look a little bit different than what you might expect to see when you're looking at an adult, but really paying attention to how they're playing, the things they're talking about, what's the content of what's going on for them. And that's really how you're going to narrow down to, okay, yeah, this is a trauma reaction. That's what we need to be treating for.
Absolutely, yes. And emotional problems are one of the biggest issues for children, certainly, who have experienced trauma or who develop PTSD or something similar. And so one of the things to look for, and really what research suggests the most common symptom you see across the board, is what's sometimes called emotional dysregulation, which is a fancy term for being unable to stay calm. You tend to get triggered by all sorts of things that are reminders of the trauma, but they may not be logical or direct reminders. In other words, a lot of times other things that were happening at the same time that a child is traumatized get conditioned, in a sense, as triggers, so that if music was playing in the background, or there's a certain smell, or even the time of year or the time of day it happened, those things can all be triggers. And that's true for adults as well. But for kids, it seems to be often an even bigger concern. And it really takes a lot of detective work to try to figure those things out, because many of us, and this is true for adults too, just don't think about what might, why might this song, for example, why might this smell be triggering me? Because it's just not logically associated with your trauma. It's just something that happened to occur at the same time.
So if you're a supervising adult that wasn't there at the time of the trauma and wouldn't necessarily know what those things are, to really pay attention to what's happening with the kid when they're having those behavioral outbursts, or when you notice that they kind of withdraw, or whatever a change in that normal typical behavior for them is, then that's going to really cue you in as the supervising adult that, okay, this is something we need to look at and maybe change in our environment, or work with their mental health provider or behavioral health provider on, or at least letting them know that we're seeing this pattern, that this is what's happening every time blank occurs
Absolutely.
every time we're
Yeah,
making
and it is-
cookies or whatever it is. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So you said something earlier that I thought was really interesting. You said big T and little T trauma. So can we talk a little bit more about what a big T or a little T trauma is?
Sure. Again, big T trauma will represent with a a capital T, sort of a timeout symbol, because in a sense it stops you in your tracks. And kids can certainly relate to that well. And that's differentiated from little T traumas, again, smaller case. So big T traumas are, you can't really, because trauma is relative, I should say. You can't automatically conclude, okay, this will be a big T trauma, but there are some things that virtually always are. Death of a parent or a close family member is probably statistically the most common big T trauma that children in the U.S. have to deal with. Physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse are also very, very common forms of big T trauma, where again, a child, especially if they are abused or neglected by a caregiver, that adds quite a bit of, in a sense, a layer of interpersonal trauma, because when, we're all dealing with trauma from COVID, for example.
Right. Yeah.
But that's not interpersonal. It's a pandemic and it's not deliberately doing something. But when a caregiver, in a sense, goes out of their way to not, they're not just protecting the child, they're actually hurting the child, that usually causes the child to develop, understandably, a lot of questions about, can I trust other people? Is the world safe? Are other people safe? What's wrong with me? And so when those big T traumas are interpersonal, when somebody does something to the child, if you will, like physical abuse or sexual abuse, you often see that extra element. Again, when it comes to grief and loss, which statistically may be the most common kind, that doesn't cause those interpersonal issues as much, in a sense, unless someone, happened to, say, murder the parent or, whatever. But it still obviously can cause significant problems for kids as well as adults. Now, something that's important to talk about, and I think you've done a great job of kind of setting up the discussion, is when is it serious enough that you need to seek help? Because trauma is so common and kids are traumatized a lot by those big T things. I'll come back to the little T ID in a second, but most kids who have a big T trauma, just like adults, don't get help. And do they, quote, need it? Well, I'm biased, as a trauma specialist. I generally feel like just about everybody does better when they at least spend a little time talking about it, processing it. But supportive parents, caregivers, teachers can do so much of that work. It really is a question of watching for, and this is kind of where I go back to our diagnostic system. They talk about significant distress and significant dysfunction. Essentially, you can have problems, but they don't become diagnoses unless they're causing enough distress to the child or to family members. The child may not be that distressed, but if it's that big a problem and it's wreaking havoc for others, then that can result in a diagnosis. Usually the child's distressed. And then the dysfunction part, is it interfering with the child's ability to have friends, go to school, live their life without getting triggered too much, getting super upset, etc. So shortly after a big T trauma, virtually everybody is thrown for a loop, if you will, goes into what we sometimes call survival mode to an extent. But most people with support, including kids, recover from that relatively quickly, depending on how horrible the trauma was, in a sense.
Yeah.
So you really do want to be very watchful, as you were talking about, and really kind of gauge, okay, does this seem like it's taking longer than it should to kind of get back to normal, or is the child suffering more than I might expect for someone at this point? Is it interfering with their functioning? If it's messing with grades, if it's ruining relationships, those are all good reasons to seek outside help.
Yeah, and I think what you said earlier about, is it taking longer than what should be expected? And now we all have this shared experience of having gone through this, international trauma
Mm-hmm.
where everyone was kind of locked down, and everyone was really uncertain, and no one knew what to do and where this thing was coming from, and how you were going to get it. So if everyone can kind of think back to March of 2020,
Yeah.
and what that really meant for everyone, and kind of that initial fear that was there. So that's sort of similar. So now everyone kind of has a little bit of this shared experience of what
Yes.
an initial trauma can look like, and then how
Absolutely.
you kind of gradually recover from it, even though we're still kind of in it, we're kind of working with it, but how you then adjusted to a new normal.
Yes.
And
Yes. Absolutely.
so that can give people a little bit of an idea
Mm-hmm.
of kind of, if you're going through that, or you see your child or the child that you're looking after going through something like that, or as a teacher, had a student that went from having, good grades to now having poor grades, or not having behavioral difficulties at school to now having lots of emotional outbursts, or difficulty getting along with their peers, a sign that maybe there's a recommendation that needs to happen there.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So turning to the little t trauma concept, the idea is that we all experience stressful events during the course of a day. And in a sense, the more resources or the more privilege that you have, the fewer of those incidents there are going to be, and the less likely they're going to turn into big T traumas. Just for example, I'm pretty privileged. During the pandemic, I've been able to, I'm back at work now for the most part, but was able to work from home, had enough resources that I was able to, help my daughter who lost her job, et cetera. And so things that, because of those resources that certainly could have been big T traumas for others, really weren't for me. I'm very fortunate in that regard. And, certainly many people are. The fewer resources you have, the more likely what might seem like, in a sense, a small frustrating thing to some of us, clearly is a little T trauma. If you only have one vehicle, or if you don't have a vehicle, or your car breaks down and you need it to get to work, to get to the store, whatever, that can become a huge problem, obviously. And so that, for example, just because it's, it can be kind of fun to talk about this with different people. What is little t, what is big T trauma? I've heard people say, I think the silliest example I've heard, in a sense, although it was sort of joking, was the local Starbucks was being remodeled so they couldn't get Starbucks before a training I did. And they were, saying maybe that's big T trauma. And these are people who are foster parents who raise kids with incredible, and so they were kind of joking. But, for people like me, not having Starbucks can be a big deal, it seems like. But in the grand scheme of things, come on. But in a sense, the fewer resources you have, the more stress you're under, the more those little T's can turn into what's sometimes called toxic stress, where it's a buildup of, people in poverty, for example, people who experience tons of prejudice, racial oppression, even if it's microaggressions, even if there aren't the big T kinds of trauma issues, those things build up over time. So there's some research that suggests that kids with a host of little T traumas can end up with the same types of problems, essentially, that kids with big T traumas have. They can go into what we call survival mode, which, again, is not a real concrete term, but it's a useful one, because it's what happens often when somebody is, well, if you think, like you said, great example, shortly after the pandemic hit, a lot of us kind of went into survival mode. It was sort of like everything went out the window except we're going to get through this without, getting sick today kind of thing. So, making the bed, meal time, everything sort of went into chaos, and most of us have reestablished routines, which is really helpful. People who are constantly being stressed like that, in a sense, they're always living like they're in a pandemic through no fault of their own. So,
right. And I want to just point out one thing that you touched on, which was privilege. And I want to recognize that some people, even though from the outside, others might say, oh, they're very privileged. They have their lives are very blessed. They have these really charmed lives. But then on
Mhm.
the inside, we never really know what's going on
Right.
inside someone's home. And so there's lots of domestic violence situations. So I also want to
Yes.
recognize, that there are those people that that go through experiences every day that are awful to come home to,
Yep.
and maybe don't have a means of escape from
Yes.
that are constantly experiencing these traumas on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And that even though other people might view them as privileged, and we just want to recognize that those
Yes.
traumas exist as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out, because I did, I don't want to suggest that trauma, affects certain people more than others because of resources, et cetera. I think having more resources in general gives you a lot more opportunities to deal effectively with it. But you're absolutely right. It's all relative.
So you started to talk about things that can be really helpful for managing trauma. So
Mhm.
let's go down that road a little bit more and talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah. In general, trauma treatment is viewed as a sort of a three-stage process. There are a number of different models, but they all pretty much fit this idea where you are initially the first stage one, is safety and stabilization. So even though if you watch, TV shows, movies, etc., and they're doing trauma work, it's always sort of the exciting, we're processing the trauma itself, because that's what's interesting to watch in a sense. But before you get to that point of actually talking a lot about the trauma and kind of working through it, we generally need to spend a fair amount of time with kids preparing them for that. So what does the safety part mean? The stabilization part is maybe a little bit clearer in a sense, because, okay, we need to teach them coping skills and other ways of getting stabilized so they are able to keep those emotions more or less regulated when they're triggered. They know how to cope. They know how to do things to help. Safety in some ways is trickier because we divide it into emotional and physical safety. And most of us understand physical safety pretty well. And the great example you gave with domestic violence is one where, if there is domestic violence in the home, there is not physical safety because people are in physical danger. And if there's no physical safety, there's no emotional safety, almost by
Right.
definition.
Yeah. So during this time where school probably was the safest place.
Exactly. Yeah. So
And having that removed. Yeah, having
Yes.
that removed becomes,
Yes.
a trauma in and of itself.
Absolutely. And we have a number of students who are desperate to be back in person because the school is their safe place, essentially. So that is so true. And so essentially it gets tricky when you have physical safety, but you don't have emotional safety. And probably the best example, again, a kind of a somewhat extreme example, but it helps to illustrate the point. We had a residential treatment center that we closed a few years ago, but luckily we closed it planfully, so we took about a year to transition kids out, got them ready to leave, found homes, etc. for them. One girl who was doing really well there, but essentially her biological family was out of the picture, so she had no, quote, family. The staff there essentially, she felt like were her family. We found a wonderful foster home for her and introduced her to the foster family, and said, hey, here's a new family for you. Congratulations. And she freaked out, understandably, because it was sort of here are your new parents, here are your new siblings, here's your new school. Anybody would freak out about that. So her emotional safety kind of went out the window at that point. And it set her back. I mean, it took, luckily she's doing great there now. So the story ended well, but it took months of work to sort of establish, these people are safe and it will be okay to leave this known place, even though it was an institution, and it becomes safe when these are these are the adults you love and who care for you. So obviously most kids are not in residential treatment, but we have a lot of kids where if the family is in survival mode or if parents, and it's almost never the case where the parents are sort of deliberately not trying to do what's best for their kids. Overwhelmingly parents want what's best for their kids and they try to do it. But if they're in survival mode, they may not have the energy or the resources to be able to give the kids what they need. And so if they can't meet those needs, even if they've got physical safety, in a sense, the kids don't have emotional safety. And so in that first phase of treatment, in addition to building those coping skills, grounding skills, self-soothing, calming skills, we're really trying to work with the family or the environments as much as possible, school, for example, as well as family, assuming they're at home, to reestablish or establish that emotional safety. Because in a sense, once they feel like, okay, this is a safe place to be because I won't be hurt physically and emotionally, I can kind of be a kid. I can say what I want to say without fear of being hurt or thrown out or something like that. Then they can thrive. Then basically when they've got those skills down, when they're out of survival mode because they've kind of reestablished emotional safety, then basically they're ready for the second stage, which is trauma process.
And we're running short on time, and we had some really good stuff that I wanted to get to. So I'm going to ask that our audience come back and join us for a part 2 of this segment.